Dakota Cody Marsh was 34 years old the day she stood in a dusty county auction hall in eastern Montana and raised her hand for a piece of land nobody else wanted. 200 acres of cracked, sun-baked earth outside the small town of Copper Hollow, abandoned for almost 2 decades after a mining runoff had poisoned the topsoil and killed every living thing on it. The auctioneer barely finished the sentence before Cody said the number, $61,000. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Men who had come to bid on real ranch land turned to look at the woman in the faded flannel jacket, holding her 7-year-old son, Miles, by the hand, and shook their heads like they'd just watched someone throw money into a well. Cody didn't flinch. She had read the geological surveys twice. She had walked that dead ground alone with a shovel and a bottle of water 3 separate times before the auction, kneeling in the dirt, pressing her palm into it the way you'd check a wound to see if it was healing. Everyone else saw a wasteland. She saw 3 old creek beds that used to feed a spring before the mining company ruined everything, and she believed, quietly and stubbornly, that dead didn't always mean gone. She moved into the collapsing farmhouse on the property with Miles that same month. She had no husband, no partner, no family nearby, just a small settlement from a workplace accident 2 years earlier, and a determination that had nowhere else to go. The town called it Marsh's Folly before she'd even unpacked her tools. The first year nearly broke her. She spent her savings hauling in clean topsoil, testing pH levels, digging swales along the contour of the land to catch what little rain fell instead of letting it run off into ditches like it always had. Her neighbor, a rancher named Dale Whitfield, who owned the biggest spread in the county, used to slow his truck down on the county road just to watch her work and shake his head. He told people at the diner in town that she'd be gone by winter, that a single mother playing farmer with poisoned dirt was the saddest thing he'd seen in years.
Some days Cody heard about the things she said secondhand from the woman who ran the hardware store. She never answered any of it. She just kept working. She planted her first batch of native cottonwood and willow seedlings that spring, 1,200 of them, along the driest of the old creek beds, hoping the roots would help hold whatever moisture came. A heat wave in July killed most of them within 6 weeks. Cody remembers sitting in the dirt that evening with dead seedlings scattered around her like the field had rejected everything she'd tried to give it. Miles found her there after dark. He didn't ask if things were going to be okay, because even at 7, he understood his mother didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She just told him she needed to figure out what had gone wrong before she tried again. So she did. She learned that the soil, stripped and compacted for years, was choking every root before it could spread. She started digging wider, shallower planting beds. She mixed in compost and ash from burned deadwood. She clustered her trees in small groups instead of spacing them out, letting the stronger shrubs shield the more fragile seedlings from the wind. Slowly, patiently, over the next 3 years, something that had been dead for 20 came back to life 1 square foot at a time. By year 4, thin green threads of grass had crept across hillsides that hadn't held anything living since before Miles was born. The dry creek beds stayed damp longer after every storm. Birds nested in the tree clusters. The dust that used to rise off that land in the wind didn't rise quite the same way anymore. Cody had planted just over 8,000 trees by hand, with almost no help, and almost nobody in Copper Hollow had bothered to notice up close. Almost nobody, except a woman named Ruth Alvarez, who ran the feed store and had quietly become the only person in town who didn't think Cody was out of her mind. One afternoon, Ruth pulled her truck over on the county road, walked up to where Cody was working, and told her in a low voice that a company out of Denver had been buying land options all through the valley without telling anyone why. Cody thanked her, filed the warning away, and kept working, because survival had never left her much room to worry about things she couldn't yet see.
3 weeks later, a line of black SUVs came up the gravel drive, kicking dust into the same air Dale used to laugh in. The man who stepped out of the lead vehicle wore a suit that looked absurd against the dry hills, and he introduced himself as Preston Kane, founder of Kane Horizon Group. He complimented her land generously without once asking how she'd built it, as if the years behind it simply didn't interest him. Within 10 minutes, he offered her $12 million for the whole 200 acres. It was more money than Cody had ever imagined seeing in her life. It would have paid off everything, bought Miles a real home, a real future, security she had never once been able to promise him. Cain framed it like a kindness, told her plainly that no bank would ever value a handful of young trees anywhere near that number, and that a woman in her position should feel fortunate he'd bothered to come himself. When she asked why his company wanted dead farmland for a luxury resort corridor, he gave her a smooth, simple answer about scenic buffers and conservation branding. But she watched his survey crew that week, and they weren't photographing her trees at all. They were marking slope angles and flagging every low point near her old creek beds with small orange stakes. She asked for time to think it over. He slid a contract across her kitchen table and told her the offer expired in 48 hours, that this was the only real chance a woman like her would ever get to walk away from hardship for good. She didn't sign, and the next morning, one of his surveyors accidentally dropped a folded map near her porch steps. Spread across it, her exact property sat outlined in small, deliberate print. Buffer parcel 4. Essential. In that single moment, alone on her porch with Miles asleep inside, Cody understood that Cain hadn't offered her $12 million for the trees standing above the ground. He wanted whatever was moving quietly beneath them. She sent her soil and water samples to Dr. Naomi Cross, an independent hydrologist who used to work for the state. Naomi's report, when it finally came, confirmed what Cody had begun to suspect. 4 years of swales, roots, and mulch had done more than green a hillside. They'd allowed rainfall to sink underground instead of running off, and a shallow aquifer long assumed dead was quietly rebuilding itself beneath her land, feeding down the valley toward wells that hadn't run reliably in a decade. Buried in public filings, Naomi found the full scope of Cain's plan, a $2.1 billion resort development that legally required an unbroken ecological corridor and proof the project wouldn't drain the valley's water. Cody's scarred, laughed-at little farm was the only parcel in the region that satisfied both conditions. $12 million wasn't generosity. It was the number Cain believed was large enough to buy her silence. She refused the offer in writing. Within days, the pressure started arriving through every side door imaginable. Her property taxes were suddenly reassessed. Her irrigation swales were flagged for a permit violation nobody had ever mentioned before. The county road leading to her land was scheduled for maintenance closures with no clear end date. None of it carried Cain's name directly. All of it led back to him. Dale kept a running joke going at the diner about how many days he figured remained before she folded. The local paper ran a piece painting her as a stubborn woman standing in the way of hundreds of promised jobs. Cody didn't fight any of it in public. She just kept working with Naomi to build an airtight record. Before and after imagery, 4 years of soil data, well readings from the whole valley, and a copy of Cain's own permit filing. Then a freak summer storm dropped record rainfall on Copper Hollow in a single night. On Cain's freshly bulldozed construction site, mud and runoff surged straight onto the county road. On Cody's land, her swales and root systems absorbed almost all of it without a single washout. The county road stayed passable near her property only because the floodwater sank into her restored ground instead of tearing through it. Nobody got hurt, but the contrast was impossible to ignore, and for the first time, Dale walked onto her land without a trace of mockery on his face. He stood quietly in the damp, stable soil and said nothing for a long moment. She didn't ask for an apology. She simply showed him how the same swale system protecting her fields could protect his ranch from the next storm, too. That conversation planted the first real crack in what the whole town had believed about Cain's promises.
The county called an emergency hearing after Cain's people accused Cody's swales of posing a flood risk to neighboring land.
The room was packed the day of the hearing, Kane seated front and center with a row of lawyers beside him. His attorney called her a self-appointed gardener playing at land management, and a few people in the crowd who once laughed at her laughed again. Cody didn't defend herself. She simply walked the room through 4 years of recorded data, Naomi's findings under oath, storm night photographs, and Kane's own leaked map labeling her land essential to a project he'd never asked her permission to include her in. The mood in the room shifted before the meeting was even over. Afterward, Kane approached her privately and raised his offer to $20 million, warning her that if she kept refusing, the whole project would collapse and the town would blame her for every lost job. Cody told him plainly that he still didn't understand what she was actually trying to protect. The following week, Kane Horizon quietly paused hiring, and half the town that had briefly started believing Cody turned right back around to blame her for the uncertainty. Flyers appeared on her gate. She didn't answer any of it. She kept tending her trees. Then Dale's own well dropped to its lowest level in decades, and he drove out to see her again, this time with no arrogance left in his voice. She helped him design his own swale system without ever bringing up a single thing he'd said about her over the years. That quiet act of help was enough to make Dale stand up publicly for her at the next town meeting. Other landowners began coming to her too, and Cody realized she didn't need to sell a single acre to build something the whole valley could actually use. She started the Copper Hollow Land Trust, training locals to restore their own dry ground, growing native seedlings at scale, and offering paid restoration work to anyone who needed it. At the final state hearing, with investors, county officials, and half the town packed into the gallery, Kane confidently predicted Cody would name a price far higher than $20 million. Instead, she stood in front of a map of her own land and said it wasn't for sale at all, not for any number. In its place, she laid out an agreement. She would keep full ownership of her land under a 99-year conservation protection. Kane Horizon would put $12 million
into a publicly audited watershed restoration fund. Groundwater use for the development would be capped for good, and local workers would get first priority on every restoration contract tied to the project. Kane mocked the proposal in front of everyone, but the investors backing his development immediately said they'd freeze financing without Cody's land legally protected, and state officials confirmed the project simply couldn't proceed without her restoration corridor. In that moment, in front of the very people who had once laughed at her in that auction hall, Kane understood he had never been negotiating with a woman he could outspend. He signed the agreement. A year later, the Copper Hollow Land Trust employed 24 local workers, several of whom had once been counting on jobs from Kane's project instead. They restored dry creek beds up and down the valley and helped ranch families build their own water systems. Kane's resort still went forward eventually, but smaller, quieter, and answerable to people who had once been invisible to him. Dale took down the old joke he used to keep about Cody's future and never mentioned it again. Cody's land never became some towering ancient forest overnight. The tallest of her trees still hadn't cleared the roofline of her farmhouse, and every summer still cost her a few young ones. But the water beneath that old dry creek bed ran a little longer every year, and deer and birds returned to ground that hadn't held anything living in 20 years. On the day her trust held its first public seedling giveaway, a long line of trucks stretched down the gravel road, filled with many of the same people who had once come just to watch her fail. Miles helped her hang a new sign at the gate that read simply, "Planted by one, protected by many." The real value in a story like this isn't the number on the check. It's the reminder that patience, quiet persistence, and care for something bigger than yourself can outlast money, mockery, and pressure alike. It teaches that real worth is often invisible until someone refuses to give up on it, and that protecting land, water, and community for the next generation matters more than any single payout ever could.